Good evening. As I introduced Dr. Casey, I would just give a bit of perspective. One aspects of his background is that he was at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. About 25 years ago, a rather visionary gentleman by the name of Douglas Johnston started a study group on the role of religion in foreign policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Out of that study group came a book called Religion, the Missing Element of Statecraft. And this background is really intended for you as students to give you a sense of the uphill struggle that it has been to establish a nuanced, complicated understanding in the policy world about religion and its place. Doug Johnson pioneered the effort to draw attention to the importance of religion to governments all around the world and to peoples all around the world. It took almost 20 years following publication of that book for there to be established in the Department of State what is now known, I guess in past tense, as the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. During Dr. Casey's tenure as director of that office and as a special representative for the government of the United States around the world, they were able to establish contact with thousands of people around the world for whom religion is a driving force in their day-to-day life, the lived religion. Having been at the State Department myself, I can witness to you it is a very difficult thing in our culture to find a place to talk about religion. 6 years of working on Arab-Israeli peace, and not once was there a way found to articulate the role of religion, potentially either in the conflict itself or in the resolution. The cultural change that your presence and your leadership meant there at State Department, Dr. Casey, should not be lost, again, on this audience of young students. That office no longer exists. That initiative has been drained of its resources. But I think it will return. The work that you have done will not be overlooked. I would just comment as well that Dr. Casey is currently director of the Berkley Center at Georgetown University. We have been blessed by previous participants and speakers from the Berkley Center, in particular Catherine Marshall, a pioneer in her own right in the role of religion and world affairs. I would then just make briefly reference to his formal biography. Dr. Casey, in addition to what I've just described, has held positions at Wheatley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., at the Center for American Progress, and CSIS. He's written a book on the ethics of the war in Iraq, as well as the role of religion in American presidential politics. He's written The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy versus Nixon, 1960, and co-editor of a forthcoming volume, The Oxford Handbook of Political Theology. He's writing a book on ethics and international politics, tentatively titled Niebuhr's Children. That, I think we all will look forward to. His degrees are a bachelor's degree from Abilene Christian, an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School, and Master of Divinity and Doctor of Theology from the Harvard Divinity School. Please join me at long last in welcoming Dr. Shaun Casey to the podium.
President and Sister Worthen, thank you for this remarkable evening and day. You have a remarkable institution here, and your international reputation is well earned. The two groups of students I met with challenged me. We had amazing discussions. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for your leadership and for your hospitality today. Fred, thank you for those kind introductions and remarks, and it's good to meet a fellow alum of the State Department. You feel my pain, and likewise. Professor Grant Underwood and Sherry, thank you for your hospitality. This has been a remarkable experience for me. About a year ago, Professor Underwood came to see me at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and he said, we'd love to have you. Now, a lot of people tell me that. A lot of people say, we'd love to have you, but indeed, you followed up with this wonderful invitation, and it's been a remarkable visit that you've set up. Thank you for all that both of you do. Maddie, thank you for that wonderful prayer. I often was asked while I was in the State Department, can we pray over you? And I said, always, please do. I need all the help I can get. So thank you, and thank you for the work you're doing with the Interfaith Student Group. You are an internationally renowned university, and I see here in my second visit why you've had that reputation and why you deserve it. And it's an honor for me to be here. I'm blown away that we have a full house to talk about interfaith harmony. And it's my honor to be with you and to share some reflections from my experience in my almost 4 years in the State Department. I'm hoping I leave enough time for question and answer. I have several people who are going to be giving me this sign if I go over. And we, I guess, have a microphone set up over here. And as I begin to wind down, perhaps you can line up over there. And I would like to get as many questions in as possible. And I'll stay here till they turn the lights off. Let me begin, I'm sorry, thank you. Give me my maximum voice. Usually people don't say I have that problem. I tend to be loud and demonstrative, so thank you for that help. Let me congratulate you for observing Interfaith Harmony Week. My guess is there are not too many American universities celebrating this week. It's a new concept. I think back in the last millennium when I was an undergraduate in a sleepy little college in godforsaken West Texas, and if someone had said we should have been celebrating interfaith harmony that week, we would have had no idea what you're talking about. The closest analogy I could come up with was that interfaith back then in West Texas meant that Texans and Oklahomans would sit down together over a chicken fried steak dinner and sort which state had the best football teams. That's what religion, interfaith, meant in the late 70s in West Texas when I was an undergraduate. Things are a bit different now, I hope in Abilene as well as in Provo. And it's a sign, I think, of maturity. It's a sign of growth. It's a sign of the growing religious pluralism of our own country, that we now can have these kinds of conversations and recognize that all across this country, the complexity and the complexion of our country is evolving in very, very complicated ways. And if we don't devote explicit time and energy to sorting this newness, we're going to find ourselves in very, very difficult spots in our culture if we don't develop the habits, the skills, the techniques of talking to one another across the religious divides that are confronting us today. Now, here I am many decades later after leaving West Texas, and I was the first American to build an Office of Religion and Global Affairs at the United States Department of State. And we engaged in thousands of religious folk around the world on our staff, perhaps even tens of thousands in the short 4 years. And we didn't have a roadmap. There was no textbook to pull off the shelf to say, this is how you do it, representing the United States government. We had to make it up as we went along. And I'm proud of what we accomplished, and I'm proud of what our staff did. So tonight, I want to spend some time really walking you through a series of stories and anecdotes to give you a sense of what we did that worked well, some of the things that perhaps we could have done better. But in my belief, there's nothing more important in our diplomacy today than our ability to connect with people around the world on the basis of their most deeply held beliefs. That if somehow we bracket that out and we say that your most deeply held beliefs are not fit for discussion and assessment, we are missing the potential to connect with people, to build a better, safer world. And without this capacity on the part of our government, we stand to make many, many mistakes that we could have otherwise avoided. So at the beginning, let me tell you 3 keys I have come to embrace in terms of interfaith conversation. And this is by way of introduction, and I'm going to draw you a quick roadmap of where I want to go for the rest of our time tonight. First of all, religious communities need to begin to see one another through lenses of mutual respect and curiosity. And let me begin with a confession that the small Christian sect I grew up in really had a solution to interfaith harmony, and it was become like us. Right. That was the solution to all the problems of diversity and conflict. Everybody had to see the world religiously as we did. And that seemed to us to be a perfect solution to any complexity the world might throw at us. Well, needless to say, that didn't work out very well. And what started out as a movement to unite all Christians ended up splitting into 3 different denominations. So I have some empirical evidence to suggest come and see the world my way proved actually to be terribly ineffective, in fact, counterproductive. Secondly, in order to enter into interfaith discussion or interreligious work, people should not be required to surrender their most deeply held beliefs as the price of admission into that conversation. In other words, interfaith harmony is not about erasing difference as a ticket to get into the conversation, but we have to respect people where they are, regardless of the diversity and the complexity, and ultimately perhaps the strangeness in encountering people across the table from us. The entrance ticket to that conversation is willing to come and be yourself and authentically express your beliefs, which undoubtedly are going to be different from other folks around that table. And finally, I want to tell you a quick story, which illustrates a point that took me a while to learn. Early on in my tenure at the State Department, I realized there were big interfaith convenings all across the world. I went to one in a great European city where 500 interreligious leaders from around the world were invited. And it was amazing. There were panels. We stayed in a 5-star hotel. We ate great food. And then I realized that this was replicated almost every month in another great European city. And I could have done nothing but go from 5-star hotel in Paris to Prague to France to Vienna, to London, and seeing essentially the same 200 leaders around the world. And we had the same conversations and nothing was actually done to change the world. So I went to Israel-Palestine for my first trip. And I went to the West Bank and visited a Catholic university there, Bethlehem University. And that's not a happy place. It's not a happy part of the world today. And it's perhaps getting unhappier by the moment. And so I walked into a faculty meeting to talk about the role of religion in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and conflict. And you don't have to have a PhD in psychology when you walk into a room of faculty and they're all sitting there like this, arms folded, hunched over, frowns on their faces, and it's because this crazy, probably not very smart State Department guys there from the United States to tell them how to fix their problems. And so the unease and discomfort was just oozing off of the faculty there. And one sociologist of religion looked me in the eye, and he sort of threw the first punch, and he said, "Dr. Casey, I have a question for you." I said, "Please." He said, "Do you believe in interfaith work as theater or praxis?" And I burst out laughing. I said, "Excuse me, but you have just explained to me the last 6 months of traveling around in these interfaith dialogues in Europe. It was theater. It was there for us to feel good about having gone and had conversations among Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists, but we all went back to our respective academic or political perches and continued on as life had not changed at all. And we would see the same people in 6 weeks in another great European city, and nothing changed. We would sign the same sort of peace, love, and joy declarations, and nothing would change around the world." And he said, and so I immediately said, "I understand your point. I take your point. What I'm interested in and what he was interested in were the deep, hard conversations, in his case, between Christians, Muslims, and Jews about the fate of that particular patch of real estate. And the theater meant nothing to him. And I said, "Brother, you have just named it. You helped me now articulate that I want to do interfaith work, not for theater, even though hotels in Vienna are lovely to go to. The food is great, and it's a stunning city, but you don't change the world in the conference rooms of luxury hotels in Europe. I want to do interfaith work to change the world and make it a better place." And I said, "Thank you for helping me give articulation to the dis-ease and discomfort I felt about some interfaith harmony." So my commendation to you as a student group, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. How do we improve the world and rid it of some of its massive injustice by recognizing we have to have the hard conversations, and we're not just here to feel good and eat good food and sign pledges of peace, love, and joy that make no difference in the world. Promise yourself in your work here, you will try to change the world such as you know it here in Provo, Utah, and in other places. Now, let me draw you a quick roadmap of where I want to go in the rest of my time. First of all, let me say, I learned the value of doing this when I was a Christian minister. I was a minister during my infinite graduate years, and I had this pattern established with my children then, that on the way home, I would say, well, what do you think of Daddy's sermon? And they developed kind of a call and answer, and they'd say, Daddy, you did a great job, but you missed several good stopping points. So I'm hoping that you will come away saying, Shaun, you did a great job tonight, and you found the right exit ramp in time. So I've got to watch here, and again, I've got some people sending me signals if I hit. But many times, if I tell people where the roadmap is that I'm going to, you can tell we're getting closer to the exit ramp. And so I tell you this for your own comfort ahead of time. First of all, I want to answer the question of why it's important that our government has the capacity to assess religious dynamics and engage around the world religious actors in our foreign policy. It's the why do this work question. But secondly, and maybe even more importantly, is the question of how do you actually do the work? In other words, you may believe deeply, as I do, that diplomacy should be based on an understanding of many things, including the complexities of global religion, but it's quite easy to do that work poorly or in harmful ways. I often told people that in the State Department, I encountered folk who would admit we've made mistakes in our foreign policy because of our willful ignorance of religion around the world, and I could recite cases. I'm going to skip over that part. But it's one thing to say you have a problem in your life. It's quite another thing to say, here's the cure or the answer to your problem. So simply walking through the halls of the State Department saying, we have a problem, brothers and sisters, doesn't get us to the real question, well, how do we do something better in the face of our poor performance in the past? And that's where I want to spend most of my time is, well, how do you do this work? But start with why and then move to how. And finally, I want to spend a few moments, since this is an educational setting, and I see some people here radically under my age, and who presumably are in classes and you're wondering about what to do with your life and you're acquiring skills. I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about how you, as students, can think about changing the world and how you can participate in this kind of work from your perch here in Provo, Utah. Why does religion matter in our diplomacy? I think the first person to point to is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She wrote a book back in 2006 called The Mighty and the Almighty. If I don't convince you in this speech about the importance of this work, read Madeleine Albright's book, because she does a brilliant job. And she tells a story that when she became Secretary of State, I guess it was in 1996, she had at her disposal armies of experts. So if a political conflict erupted in Central Europe, she had historians she should call on and say, please get me up to speed on the history of this conflict. There were historians on the staff. If there was an economic global issue that erupted, she had an army of economists she could call and say, please brief me and get me up to speed on the economic history of this country or this region. If a political conflict arose somewhere, the same was true on politics. She had an endless army, thousands of experts with one email or phone call she could summon. But when it came to religion, she had no one to talk to. And she immediately found out there was Israel-Palestine, there were the Balkan Wars, there were all kinds of things going on around the world where religion cut across it, and she literally had nobody to turn to on her staff to say, make me smarter on the religious dimensions. And she says it's insane in today's world, where according to one Pew Research poll, 84% of the world's population expresses some form of religious affiliation. And so there she sat on the top of this large institution, the U.S. Department of State, and she had nobody to call as experts to help her become smarter on the vast religious dimensions of the conflict she saw around the world. So here we have a former State Department leader saying, We need to have this. Every Secretary of State needs to have this intellectual and expertise capacity at their summons, and yet we didn't have it. Then John Kerry, who I had the privilege of meeting in 2005, when I was a lowly assistant professor of Christian ethics at a fairly obscure theological seminary in Washington, D.C., I was introduced to John Kerry after he'd lost the presidential race. And as you heard, part of my research interest is in religion in American presidential politics and other areas, religion in American foreign policy. Were it not for one of our Board of Governors sharing his vast network of contacts, he introduced me to John Kerry in 2005. Had he not done that one connection, I would have never ended up in the State Department, nor would I be speaking in front of you today. Never underestimate the value, in particularly students, of connections. So here was one connection made in 2005 that changed my life 8 years later in 2013, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But after I met John Kerry, we talked about religion in American presidential politics, but we very quickly discovered we had the same interest in religion in U.S. foreign policy. Now, we came from two very different symbolic universes. I grew up in a tiny, one-horse, cotton-farming southern town where I didn't even know that Harvard and Yale existed. And here was a guy who went to Yale College, traveled the world as a child because his father was a Foreign Service officer, and ironically, we hit it off and we developed a relationship in 2005. I helped him write some speeches. We stayed in conversation with one another. So then in 2013, when he becomes Secretary of State, in the process of being briefed by an endless army of attorneys when he became secretary, one of them said, "Mr. Secretary, in February 2009, President Obama signed an executive order that expanded President Bush's faith-based offices from about 5, I think it was, to 12. And as part of that executive order, he gave the State Department legal authorization to start a religion advisory office in the State Department. And for whatever reason, Secretary Clinton never launched that office. Now, she tried and she laid the groundwork for it, but it never became official. So when Kerry heard he had this option, he turned to his chief of staff, who I had also met in 2005 when he worked for Secretary Kerry then in the Senate. He said, "Call Shaun and see if you can twist his arm into coming and launching this office." But because I'd made that acquaintance 8 years before, I'd stayed in touch, and we had a network of which we were part, John Kerry thought of me in that moment, and 3 days later, I had a handshake deal to come in and launch this office. So it pays to build friendships. You never can predict where a relationship will go and what it might lead to years later. So when you're at that shoe leather stage of looking for a job and thinking about that eschatological notion of postgraduate real life work, keep in mind that connections pay dividends. And you can never predict, as in my case, where a relationship that had started 8 years ago, thanks to the grace and love of an intermediary, it led to a life-changing opportunity for me. You never know where these opportunities are going to come from. Never turn down an offer to sit down and talk with somebody who might be in a position to either offer you a job or tell you about a job 8, 9, 10 years later. Now that's the free advice, so let me keep going. But Kerry believed we could do better as a country in our foreign policy in assessing religious dynamics and engaging religious actors. And there were diplomatic dividends to be claimed if we got better at that. Now, what he asked me to do was to take his intuition and build an institution around it. He turned to me and said, "You figure out how to do this in a smart way. I just know it needs to be done." And I was on my way. I also believe that one of the keys to our success and keys of understanding religion as a global force, as a diplomatic force, is that religion is powerful, and to give you the $10 word of the night, it's multivalent. That is, people have done unspeakably bad things in the name of religion. People have done amazingly courageous and heroic things to help the world in the name of their faith, and every stop in between those two poles. Now, there's some people in our world today that say religion poisons everything. There are other people who say religion cures everything. And I'm here to tell you it's neither one of the poles. If you look at all religious activity around the world, it's neither hot nor cold. It's everything, including everything in between. So that calls for prudence, that calls for discernment, that calls for understanding to see where the power in religious communities is headed. And you can never predict, and it's never the same in two different locations. It is incredibly complex, and it's incredibly hard work to try to understand the difference of the dynamics across the world in the many countries around the world. Now, I would quickly add that willful ignorance of lived religion has cost American lives. It's cost hundreds of thousands of other countries' lives. It has added trillions of dollars to our deficit. And if we are smart, learning people, we will affirm the fact that in not too far back in our history, we have made grievous errors in our foreign policy because we did not understand the power of lived religion in certain countries around the world. Now, I'm not going to berate that or exegete it, but I think you can say that indeed ignorance has cost us. And the last reason for why religion matters in diplomacy is simply to say successful diplomacy depends on knowledge, analysis, and engagement. So when you walk into a room as a diplomat, into a group of religious leaders in a conflict-prone area, you better have done your homework. You don't walk into meetings like that and wing it and assume, well, we'll just figure this out because I'm just so bloomin' smart. You have to go prepared. You have to understand the depth of the relationship. You have to understand the pitfalls and the opportunities, but you also have to show up. So it takes hard work. It takes smart people to make you smart when you walk into those rooms. So you add all of that up, I think there's a compelling case for why we need to do this kind of work. Now let me move to part two, and that is, how do you do this work? The most sobering moment came early in my tenure. You walk in on your opening day, you sign a bunch of forms, HR forms and all this. You fill out endless paper, and then suddenly you're standing before an American flag and a total stranger says, raise your right hand, and you take a pledge of allegiance to the country and to defend the Constitution. And then they quickly move you into a drab room, tiny room, nothing hanging on the wall, no other people around. It's called transition space. And you live in transition space for a number of weeks till they find you a real desk. And so there I was thinking, this is amazing. I have this great opportunity. And then I found myself sitting in a room with bad lighting. I had a desk. I had a phone that worked. I had a computer that didn't work. And I had a wastebasket. And I thought, I have a long way to go. There's 7.6 billion people on the planet and probably 76 billion forms of religiosity. And right now, it's just me. And I felt very tiny. I felt very alone, and I felt very intimidated. And I thought, I've got a long way to go before we launch this airplane and get it airborne. The smartest thing I did was to hire a former colleague at CSIS as my chief of staff. And she was a young woman who I'd met on a project that CSIS ran, and I was actually a subject matter expert, and she refers to that as the period where she signed my checks, as opposed to the era where I signed her checks. And between the two of us, when it was just the two of us, we decided we want to create an office culture because we have a huge, daunting task ahead of us. And as a graduate school professor, I'd never built anything larger than a seminar of 12 people that lasted 13 weeks. So I didn't exactly have a vast repertoire of accomplishment in building new institutions. And so I thought, one of the things I want to do, if we get nothing else right, we're building an office that's going to engage the world in interreligious ways. We have to reflect that diversity in our staff. But I can't say, I need 3 Hindus, 4 Jews, 5 Muslims, and which one are you going to be? The federal government doesn't allow you to hire on the basis of religion. So I thought, let's do 2 things. First of all, let's figure out what we want our office values to be. Because if we didn't reflect diversity and have a skill set to engage across religious diversity, we were dead before we started. So we came up with a list of 6 values. I think that's right, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 values that we wanted to build an office culture around, because it was our belief if we don't set a goal, we may not reach that culture. And we had to project an honest, authentic interfaith understanding in our own shop, Because if we fought with each other and we didn't get along across the religious divides, how could we possibly engage effectively around the globe? So here's our list. Now, this is not Aristotle, it's not the gospel, it's not the Hebrew Bible, but it's not bad. I think you're welcome to your opinions. So the first thing we said, we want an office where people seek joy in their work. If you don't enjoy engaging across religious divides, this is not going to be the place for you. Secondly, I want people who do high quality work. The clock was ticking. We had limited resources. The planet was on fire. We were in a hurry. Third, we wanted to be a teaching and learning organizations. I have to make a confession. I'm an alleged expert in religion. I met religious groups in the 3.5 years I was in the State Department I had never heard of before. So the Yazidis come to you. And they say, our people are trapped on Mount Sinjar, and ISIS is about to kill 40,000 of our brothers and sisters. And I'm thinking, I don't remember the day we covered Yazidis in world religion class. And I can't admit that right now, but I'm going to have to go through this meeting hearing them describe to me the plight of this community I knew nothing about. It's a big globe. It's a big planet. There's a lot of diversity. I had to hire people who knew what I didn't know. I knew what I knew, and it was a tiny sliver of the Christian world. I didn't know about Yazidis and dozens of other groups I was still learning. So we had to be a teaching and learning organization where we shared our knowledge with each other. And somehow the whole became larger than the individual parts. Fourthly, we had to be a relationship and family-friendly work environment. We had staffers who were 23, and we had staffers like me who were 23 plus a lot of years. Okay. We had, my mother is now 96. I knew at any point the phone could ring and I might have to get on a plane. We had people who lost parents. We had people who gave birth to children. And every stop, we had to pledge to one another, we have each other's back. Because if we're going to be together for 4 years, it's going to be changed. Life happens, and we have to be willing to step in and help. Fifthly, we said we have to keep an open door and collaborate. The key to our success was collaborating with the 80,000 other employees of the State Department. There were 30 of us and 80,000 of them, and part of our mission was to make them better on religion. So we couldn't be condescending. We had to be collaborative. And lastly, and this may be the most important thing, was we had to drive out fear. I've worked in work environments where fear was the coin of the realm in motivating people. I didn't like that. I didn't thrive in that environment. I always swore if I ever had a chance to organize more than a graduate seminar of 12 people and build something real, I was going to do everything I could to build a culture where we drove out fear. So for instance, a Jewish staffer could turn to a Muslim staffer and say, I don't understand this aspect of your faith. Can you make me smarter? Feel free to admit what you do not know. And that takes courage to admit what you don't know in a context of smart people. But I think building this kind of culture was absolutely crucial to our mission. Because if we didn't get along, if we didn't model interfaith, interreligious harmony ourselves, we absolutely would be frauds when we went around the world trying to address these issues. Now, when I got to the point of identifying talent, it got kind of interesting because, again, I couldn't say, well, you're religion X, come on in, or you're religion Y. I'm sorry, we've got plenty of religion Y over here. You're lovely, but I can't hire you. What I would often do is I would slide this list of values across the table on a page, and I would just say, could you read this and give me your reaction? Now, some people, when I slid it over, they wouldn't even pick it up. They just sort of leaned over and read it, and then looked at me like, I don't get it, and would slide it back to me. And I'd say, thank you for coming. I've learned so much from our conversation. Don't call us, we'll call you. I had other folks who had worked in the State Department for a long time who teared up and said, I've never been in a workplace where anybody cared about any of these values, where no one said the quality of our interaction here stateside was crucial for the quality of our interaction and our effectiveness around the globe. And if they lit up on that, I would ask them other questions like, can you describe for me examples in your own professional work history where you have actually crossed religious boundaries and interacted with people from a religion that's not yours, if you have a particular religion, or can you show me where you've worked with different religions? And people had amazing stories to talk about their global experience. And those were the people I needed, people who knew American diplomacy, who knew the State Department bureaucracy, but had real experience around the world working across various religious communities. And I found an amazing, incredibly talented group of people. But I didn't say, what is your religious experience? And ironically, some of my best staffers were people who I'm not sure ever had a personal religious thought themselves, but found professionally the idea of assessing religion and understanding religious communities to be endlessly fascinating. So we had a significant slice of our staff who, frankly, as far as I could ever tell, never had any particular religious commitments. But then we had a diverse set who, in fact, represented a glorious rainbow, if you will, of diverse experience in their own personal religious lives. Now, the first thing we did after we began to hire up is we brought in 3 small offices that already existed in the State Department that had some religion theme. So the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism was moved into my office from another part of the bureaucracy, and we gave that person far more staff resources than they had ever had as a kind of tiny office somewhere else in the bureaucracy. The special representative to Muslim communities was moved into my office, and that person was charged with being our diplomat, frankly, to the larger Muslim world. And he had a remarkable remit and a remarkable set of talents. And then the last person who was brought in from an existing office was the special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is a 57-nation member organization populated by Muslim-majority countries. So we brought in some existing offices, we wrapped them in, and suddenly we were ready to roll. We were ready to do the work and engage around the world. Let me run just a quick list of issues, and I'm going to, if we have time left, and I realize I'm getting close to the 45-minute mark, describe in deeper detail 2 or 3 things we did. But we worked on monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. Tragically, anti-Semitism is growing and spiking in this country, but also around the world. And the quality of anti-Semitic acts is changing. The acts are now more public, and they're more violent. And they're growing somewhat in number. A very, very disturbing trend. We spend a lot of time not just playing whack-a-mole in responding to anti-Semitic episodes around the world, but we also began to do the research question, how do we explain the contours and drivers of anti-Semitism, and can we find people on the ground who are doing a good job of trying to prevent these kinds of anti-Semitic acts? And if we find them, can we spread their best practices and lessons learned around, and can we help them find financing to do more of their work? So we weren't content just simply raising a flag and complaining when it happened. We were trying to solve the problem and tamp it down. We also fought Islamophobia around the world, particularly as the refugee crisis exploded in 2014, which I'm going to say more about. The number of Muslim refugees spreading into Europe and coming into the United States and Canada actually spurred a response of Islamophobia. And again, similarly to anti-Semitism, we tried to understand what was it in Europe and some of the secular and Christian communities that sparked the Islamophobic reactions, the visceral sort of thoughtless response to, if you're a Muslim, I do not like you. If you're a Muslim, I'm going to meet you with violence. What was the chemical formula, if you will, that produced that kind of response in the West? We worked on anti-public corruption. Interestingly enough, if we have time, I'll talk about one project we ran in Nigeria where religious communities proved to be powerful moral voices in Nigeria, supporting the new government and fighting rampant public corruption from the local level all the way up to the higher echelons of the national government. Some religious communities are very powerful national voices for the good. And this public corruption issue was one space where we found historically the State Department had not engaged those communities and exhorted them and empowered them to speak courageously at the local level and at the public level in countries where corruption was a growing problem. We also worked on the Sustainable Development Goals. We tried to find and help religious communities that were working to eliminate extreme poverty, who are working to fight and mitigate climate change, and to participate in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. If you don't know about the SDGs, Google them. It's where the countries of the world have come together and set 17 goals by 2030 with respect to eliminating extreme poverty and providing opportunity in terms of human rights to an amazing array of people. And religious communities all around the world are working to mitigate climate change, to build economies that indeed lift people out of extreme poverty. We made sure that faith communities around the world were at those tables as they drew up the plans, frankly, and made the plans to meet these 17 amazing and challenging goals. We fought for gender rights. We combated female genital mutilation around the world. We engaged youth communities. We fought, as I said, for public corruption. And one of the most amazing things I got to do was to help normalize diplomatic relations with Cuba. This is one of the most unexpected curveballs that came down, where suddenly the Pope has encouraged Cuban leaders and American leaders to sit down and come to some new understanding, and it happened, and none of us knew about it till we read in the papers that indeed it was happening. And I was lucky enough to be one of the first diplomats from the United States to travel to Cuba. The Cuban government, in their generosity, gave me 36 hours and restricted me to Havana, thinking that would be plenty of time, and I couldn't do too much damage in that. But in that time, I met with over 26 separate religious communities, and I asked them questions. How has normalization with America helped your community? Where do you think your community is going to be in 10 years? And do you think America should lift the embargo, the economic embargo? And I had a series of absolutely fascinating discussions. I was the first American diplomat to go in and meet these people since indeed the Cuba, the Fidels, Castro's rather, came into power in the late 50s and early 60s. Let me segue then into just a couple of specific issues, and I'll try to wrap it up here. ISIS exploded on the world's stage in mid to late 2014, and suddenly over 1 million refugees were headed north to Europe, and vastly overwhelming the capacity of Europe to settle them. At this point, according to the United Nations, there are over 25 million refugees, and a refugee is somebody who's fled their country across a national border, fleeing persecution. And in addition to those, there are over 40 million internally displaced people. That means people have left their homes, but they're still within the borders of their host country. Between the two, you add them up, there are more than 65 million people tonight who are either refugees or internally displaced people. That is the largest sum of human beings on the move in the history of the world. That's larger than the number of refugees who fled Europe in World War II. Now, that's the kind of statistic that keeps me awake at night, as a theologian, as a lapsed diplomat, and as, frankly, a Christian. What is my responsibility? What is our responsibility to those 65 million people? The average length of stay for a refugee in a United Nations refugee camp is somewhere between 17 and 21 years. Think about that. How would you like to have spent the first 21 years of your life in the United Nations refugee camp along with a couple of 100,000 other people, essentially trapped and nowhere to go? That's the plight that's facing most of these 65 million people. Now, I was an alleged expert as a religion scholar in public-private partnerships between the U.S. government and private enterprise. I was chagrined to learn that with refugees, the State Department pays for the first 90 to 120 days of a refugee's life in the United States. And the State Department doesn't do the work itself, but we had 9 implementing partners who we gave money to, and they did the actual physical resettlement work. 6 of those 9 agencies or institutions are religiously affiliated, and I didn't know that. And I was an alleged academic expert on this space. But what that did is this was the only domestic policy space the State Department worked in. I then had sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card to go and visit. So in 2016, I visited 6 refugee resettlement centers around the country. I went to Jersey City, New Jersey. I went to Baltimore. I went to Dallas, Texas. I went to Phoenix, Arizona. I went to Des Moines, Iowa, and I went to Chicago. In the course of that year traveling around, I met with about 120 refugees. So each center I went to, I met with about 20 refugees to hear their stories. The first one of those visits was in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I apologize in advance. If you're from Jersey City, I don't mean to insult you, but let me just kind of say it's not the center of Western culture. It's kind of a tough place. It's certainly an expensive place to live, and if you're getting $1,000 to stretch over 90 to 120 days for $1,000 per person in a family, Jersey City is not where you would go to try to make that experiment work. So here I am in an airless, hot room, 20 refugees from 7 different countries, and I ask, so how's it going? Okay? And it was one of the toughest hours I spent in my life, because I heard people say, I heard one young man who was a painter who painted apartments in the greater New York area. He said, I'm spending $360 a month on transportation, just bus passes, subways. You subtract that from $1,000, and that doesn't leave a whole lot. And rent's high. The ESL classes they were taking were very uneven. The American system puts a premium on refugees finding work quickly. And all 6 of these centers I went to had an employment rate of about 80 to 85% within the first 6 months, which meant in this room I had attorneys, I had doctors, I had engineers in their country of origin. And the only work they can pretty much find is doing the graveyard cleanup office shift. Now imagine, you've got a JD in your country, you've got a master's degree in engineering, or you're an MD, and the licensing doesn't fit American licensing standards, and the only work you can find is working from midnight till 7 or midnight to 8, emptying wastebaskets in office towers. And you're doing it because you fled persecution and you hope your children will grow up to have a better life, but you effectively are sacrificing any hope of a real professional career. Now, by the end of this hour, I'm hanging my head. I am really bereft at that point. And I'm the guy with the fancy suit who's come from Washington, right? I'm hearing the stories. I'm not living them. And the most amazing thing happened at the very end. There was a Syrian couple and had just this astonishingly beautiful daughter. She was maybe 2 years old and full of life and full of energy. And he's saying, I'm afraid on the streets of Jersey because people think I'm a Syrian and they think I'm a terrorist. And our governor in New Jersey had said horrible things about Syrian refugees. And the wife was a professional, and she too was cleaning offices. And she picked up on my depression, and she said, Dr. Casey, I sense you're upset. I want you to know that everybody here knows we're going to be in a better place a year from now. And I was shamed by my privilege, and I was shamed by my dejection. They were the heroes. They were the courageous folk who had taken years to flee some of the most despicable acts of terror and abuse and violence because they thought America was the land of opportunity, and they were willing to pay that price. When I was in Dallas, Texas, I met a man who had been in a UN refugee camp for 17 years, and I met him on his 4th day in the United States. Now, again, I lived in Abilene, Texas. I'm allowed to say this. Dallas, Texas is not where I would choose to go if I had to land somewhere. And again, I apologize if you're from Texas. We could talk afterwards. But nevertheless, this man was crying tears of joy because I asked him, I asked, how are things going? What's working for you? What's not working? And this man said, Shaun, I love America. I get to work with my hands. And for the first time in 17 years, the fruit of my labor is feeding my children. I've never been able to experience that in the last 17 years. And again, he saw America as the place to save his family, build a new life. He was a Muslim. He felt welcomed. And I said, shame on you, Shaun. Shame on you for not believing as they believe about the opportunity in this land. An extraordinary outpouring. We have resettled tens of thousands of refugees fleeing some of the most despicable human horror inflicted on other human beings. And the amazing thing is, what I saw in each of these centers is the interfaith cooperation that's helping in the resettlement of these people. I guess it was in 2016, I think it was 48% of the refugees we resettled were Christian, 46% were Muslim, and the remaining few percentages was Noah's Ark. But what we saw was that when a refugee resettlement center successfully settled refugees, it was because churches and mosques and synagogues all pitched in and said, we don't care what your religious background. We will work together as brothers and sisters to make sure you get a new start in life. We'll get you into school. We'll help you find work. We'll help you get the services you need. And we'll help introduce the American system of democracy to you. And we hope that eventually you become tax-paying citizens here as well. Now, the political commentary is all that's under threat today. I don't want to beat that drum too loudly, but the truth is the number of refugees we are now resettling is coming down to zero. Under President Reagan, we routinely resettled 200,000 refugees a year. Under President Obama, the most we resettled was 85,000. It's looking that we're now down to about 29,000 a year currently. We can do so much better. And the key to that success is interfaith harmony, where people across the religious contours of America come together and say, we too will extend a hand of help to those who are under the most privilege, under the most attack because of their specific faith communities. I am proud of the LDS Church, and particularly for the statement they released about DACA kids. And I assume you know what deferred action for early arrivals, what that's about. My guess is here at BYU, you actually have DACA enrolled students whose very time here in America is under threat if Congress doesn't act by March 5th. So one of the most vulnerable people in our society are at risk. And some of them may be here, some of them may be your classmates. Let me just read you the statement. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is established in 188 nations around the globe. Now that's just about every country, not quite, but 188 is getting close. Issues of immigration and legal status are of concern for many of our members. Most of our early church members immigrated from foreign lands to live, work, and worship, blessed by the freedoms and opportunities offered in this great nation. Immigration is a complex and sometimes divisive issue. As we have stated before, we believe that our first priority is to love and care for one another as Jesus Christ taught. Each nation must determine and administer its policies related to immigration. The church does not advocate any specific legislative or executive solution. Our hope is that in whatever solution emerges, there is a provision for strengthening families and keeping them together. We also acknowledge that every nation has the right to enforce its laws and secure its borders, and that all persons subject to a nation's laws are accountable for their acts in relation to them. We welcome the sincere efforts of lawmakers and leaders to seek for solutions that honor these principles and extend compassion to those seeking a better life. Specifically, we call upon our national leaders to create policies to provide hope and opportunities to those sometimes referred to as dreamers, who grew up here from a young age and for whom this country is their home. They have built lives, pursued educational opportunities, and have been employed for years based on the policies that were in place. These individuals have demonstrated a capacity to serve and contribute positively in our society, and we believe they should be granted the opportunity to continue to do so. That's powerful stuff. And you should be proud of your church for taking that stand and expressing those principles. And indeed, I hope our national leaders heed the principles that they called for. You have demonstrated, if you're part of the LDS Church, I think a commitment to righteousness and justice on these issues, and you should be proud of your leadership. I could go on and on. Let me begin to close by talking about some of the work we did in Israel-Palestine. Martin Indyk, who was our chief negotiator and former ambassador to Israel, called our office in to work with the three religious communities there and their brothers and sister communities here in the United States to rally public support for their negotiators at the table. Now, ultimately, the peace negotiations fell apart. We did not come to a solution, but we recognized finally the role of religious communities in helping to solve that set of very, very complicated issues. If and when the negotiations start up again, it's my hope that American diplomacy will continue to engage the religious leaders that are involved in that particularly vexed space. We worked in Ukraine, we worked in Burma, we worked trying to mitigate conflict in a number of areas where the issues were different and the dynamics were never the same. We had a set of engagement rules when we dealt with conflict. The first one was you have to show up. You can't establish dialogue if you don't actually show up to have one person can't have a conversation. Number one. Number two, you have to show humility when you do show up. A lot of people see diplomats from America as ugly Americans, just by definition. We had to demonstrate a form of honest humility that said, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to help you find solutions. We had to do our homework. We had to walk into rooms understanding the history and the dynamics and the complexities of the room. We often had to do what I call playing the piñata. We talked about this at dinner tonight. A lot of people around the world are unhappy with American foreign policy. That probably shouldn't come as a surprise to you. It certainly didn't come as a surprise to me when I would visit, say, Muslim-majority countries that we'd had a hard set of relationships with. I would not be defensive about American foreign policy. I had to hear their complaints about what we had done historically, and then hope, after they beat the piñata a little bit, or otherwise known as me, we can then move on to a real discussion. But sometimes you have to go through the piñata phase to get to the real discussion phase, and that's part of being a diplomat. Sometimes you just have to listen and hear people out. You had to ask good questions then when it came the time to have a real discussion, and you had to listen well. And you had to see the opportunities for having a real diplomatic conversation where you might actually make some progress towards agreement on whatever the divisive issues of the day were. But it took skill, it took practice, and you had to look for zones of possible agreement in the course of that conversation. So let me bring this home. I'm a little bit past 45 minutes. What can you do? How can you help? First of all, I think the answer is be informed. Read a newspaper, or at least check your iPhone a couple times and go to the right website. Understand what's going on in the world. It's complicated. It's messy. But even in Provo, I think they have internet access. And I've actually read the New York Times while I'm here online. So I know those resources are within your reach here. Many of you have phenomenal linguistic skills. I've seen surveys that talk about the Salt Lake City, Provo area as having the highest concentration of multilingual Americans in any other area of the world. Now, there's a reason for that. I don't need to explain that. I expect you've lived that. You know why that's true, right? But consider the Forward Service. This is a place where you can use the cultural experience you've had, where you can use the multilinguistic skills you have worked hard to acquire. It's a place where you can go back and live abroad again because of your understanding of diverse cultures and your capacity to learn more cultures. Many of you have that skill set that enable you to pass the Foreign Service exam and enter into this life of public service where you can do a form of interfaith and interreligious harmony that a lot of professional options don't offer you. There are, frankly, a lot of LDS folk in the Foreign Service because of these facts. Think about that. Think about that as an option. Talk to resources here about that as a career option. There's a reason a lot of your older brothers and sisters have found the path to Washington, D.C. to do this kind of work. You will have the opportunity to rebuild the capacity that I built in the State Department that's now gone away. I am completely confident that we proved the concept in my 4 years at the State Department that doing this kind of work makes a huge difference in our diplomacy. And even though it may be depressed now, it's going to come back because we proved to Washington it's effective and it can be done. Now, it may be in a different form. It may be not an office. It may be lodged in a number of other places in the bureaucracy. I really don't care about that because the mission can be carried out from a multitude of perches. If you care about peace, if you care about fighting extreme poverty, if you believe in human rights for all people, there is no better place to work for those missions than the State Department of the United States. It's not the only place, but it's a great place to do that. Now, in the church of my childhood, no service or gathering ended without an altar call. Now, I'm not going to subject you to that, so you can breathe. I'm not asking for volunteers to come forward. But I'm issuing you a call nonetheless. Scripture teaches us that to whom much is given, much will be required. You have the gift of a BYU education. You're earning it, but it's also being supplied to you because of professors and administrators and presidents. You are in the process of receiving a great gift that very, very few people on this planet get to receive. And with that comes deep, hard responsibility. You have been given much, much will be required of you. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. I didn't leave as much as I should have. We have a microphone over here, so please, if you've got questions, please line up here, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And I'm going to keep talking until somebody in the front row tells me to shut up. So let's see what we can do. So tell us your name and give us your question, please. All right, we on there?
Yeah, my name is McKinley Smoot. I just had a question, having actually had experience in dialogue within multiple religions, and like the example that you gave in Israel and the strife in the Middle East, how did you as a department deal with religious exclusive truth claims that tend to cause division?
Well, I mean, if you know anything about religion, most religions do, in fact, make some form of exclusive truth claims. And if you say, okay, we're going to pick the winner here, you're going to have losers in the room, too. And diplomacy is not about picking winners and telling losers, well, sorry about you, but here are the winners. I think in Israel, we know the issue set. There are no surprises there. You can sort the issues and you can find the issues online. Really, the question is, where are you going to find compromise and where are you going to make trades, okay? And not every one of those issues is based on an absolute truth claim that cannot be negotiated. In fact, I would argue that just about every one of them can be negotiated. In other words, there are potential agreements there, and people have pointed out where they are. So frankly, in that case, it's not adjudicating the absolute truth claim so much as it is being able to say, okay, I'll go half an inch if you'll come half an inch toward me, and we'll find the hard part has been the realistic political trading back and forth on the issues, and that's the hard work of diplomacy. So can we find a way where nobody's truth claims get trampled and nobody's is ascendant to the exclusion of the others, and yet still sort the nitty-gritty political issues that are attached to some of those truth claims? Now, it is true there have been historic conflicts around the world where Group A simply will not concede anything to Group B, and Group B will not either. And sometimes, as in my childhood household of 5 children, parents had to separate the children. And so you found a way to temporarily stop hostilities and hope that in that interregnum new avenues emerge. So you don't always, in fact, you probably fairly rarely completely resolve conflict once and for all. It has to be managed. So that's a great question. I guess I would not accept the premise that adherence to absolute truth claims means there's no political agreement to be found. It's hard, and it's harder when you think God is on your side and God is not on the other guy's side. That does make it complicated and difficult. I don't think it makes it impossible to find agreements. But thank you. Great question. Appreciate it.
I'm Emma. I was wondering, since you had mentioned working with a lot of minority religions, and I have an interest in a lot of the minority religions that are kind of, you see them a lot in the US. I don't know how common they are in other communities, but I was wondering if you had ever had any, whether they're diplomatic or just personal, like interactions with practitioners of Jewry or heathenry or Wicca or other types of neo-pagan religions, and how that's kind of affected your work.
Two things. Just about every religion is a majority somewhere and a minority somewhere else. But now there are some that are probably so small they're always minorities. To your specific question, yes, we had a number of communities come to us and say, we don't think we're on your radar screen because we're not Abrahamic faiths, or we're not. So we did. We tried to establish relationships with them. Our door was always open, and we were very careful to say, we don't have favored religious groups. We don't have disfavored religious groups. We were radically inclusive. We would meet with anybody who wanted to meet with us. And sometimes we had to go out into highways and byways and find them. But given the complexity of religion around the world, and again, there were only 30 of us. We couldn't identify every religious community around the world. And we just, as I said, I discovered personally a number of religions I was absolutely unfamiliar with. Now, in most every case, somebody on our staff knew them or knew about them, and that was the joy of building an inclusive, broad, experienced staff. So we never said, oh, those guys, they're so tiny, why would we waste our time on them? We absolutely never did that, because religious minorities are often the first victims in conflict where religion is a factor. So we had to be particularly sensitive to, now, the other reality is some religious groups do not like being called minority religious groups. So language and vocabulary sometimes got very, very complicated. Because nobody wants to be known as the guys that get kicked by everybody else. And I get that, right? So we had to be very careful. So we often did not use the language of religious minorities, because we discovered in some contexts that was not received well. So I guess our default position was, we will meet with everybody. We will meet with anybody. And when we went into specific international or foreign context, we tried to research very hard. One of the tools we commended to embassies was building a religious landscape, so that embassies knew who all the religious actors were. One of our staffers famously said, when bullets are flying, that's a tough time to start building a relationship. And so we commended to our embassies the ongoing building of relationships and communication with as a diverse a set of religious communities as they knew existed, so that if conflicts ever arose, you weren't meeting somebody for the first time in a foxhole. So oftentimes our embassies would do these landscape exercises where they were trying to identify every religious community in their country and finding people to engage with them. And we commended that, because they had an ability to connect in a way sometimes we couldn't from Washington, D.C. So thank you. It was a great question.
Thank you.
Meandering answer
there. My name is Khalil, and I have a question about how did the Israeli-Arab conflict affect the global interfaith of religions together? That's first question. Second question is, how did the world politics and foreign policies affect the religions? We talked about religion affecting policies. How about the other way around?
Okay.
And what about you talking about anti-Semitism and these stuff, about labeling of
Right.
combating labeling of other people, Muslim being this, Christian
Right.
being this, Jew
Right.
being this, any type of labeling.
Okay. I can usually hold two questions in my brain at one time, so forgive me if I
problem.
don't get to all three. Interestingly enough, in Israel-Palestine, senior religious leaders across the three religions actually know each other. Now, they don't always advertise this in public, but they've got relationships. The hard part, though, is the mobility question. It's hard for a lot of Palestinians, be they Christian or Muslim, to get into Israel proper. And they can be arbitrarily detained or prevented from coming. And conversely, not a lot of Jews in Israel have regular access to the West Bank in Palestine. And so there, certain leaders across the three religions do know each other, and they do have commerce with each other. And there's some pretty interesting dynamics there, positive dynamics. The hard part is when you have a generation of children grow up, and there's a big wall between you, and sometimes you can see over that wall, but you don't actually ever have human-to-human contact. So when you've got people living in proximity, but literally prevented physically from interacting with each other, that's a petri dish for all kinds of nefarious things to grow. So you get anti-normalization dynamics among some Muslim communities, and then you get stereotyping of Muslims in some Jewish youth communities. And that's very hard to address because they are physically separated from each other. And that's a tough nut to crack. So the first question was how do governments influence religious dynamics? In a multitude of ways. Governments can register religions and keep them apart and limit some in terms of their mobility or the rights they have access to. So many times government intervention in the religious communities ends up serving, by my lights, nefarious political ends that are damaging to the freedom of religion to untold millions of people around the world. I always get nervous when governments start regulating religious communities, because in my experience, there tend to be winners and there tend to be losers in that. And so there are a multitude of ways that governments can corral, harass, empower, cut off funding for religious communities, and it's a very complex and depressing interaction many times. So thank you. I think I got to your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is George Garcia, and for the last few months I've been working with the Utah State Board of Education to try to change the culture of social studies here in the state.
Fantastic.
And I recognize that your expertise, of course, is not in education but in diplomacy, and of course recognizing the limits set by the Constitution on social studies and the marginalization of social studies in the last forever in schools. How do you think social studies can be used to help like rising generations understand pluralism, understand the role of religion in the world?
One of the most amazing places I went in my refugee tour was Des Moines, Iowa. Now, when I think of Des Moines, Iowa, I think of cornfields. If you build it, they will come, or is that maybe they were different? Yeah, no, that's the right movie, right? I think of baseball and things like that, and more corn. Des Moines, Iowa has been a center for refugee resettlement going back to the Vietnam era. There's a proud tradition in Iowa of accepting refugees, and the current iteration is also true. I'll get these numbers wrong, but you can verify them. The superintendent of schools there, who is one of my all-time heroes, I think has a school system of like 32,000 students. I think that's right. That may be too high. A quarter of them are either refugees or children of refugees from an innumerable list of countries. And it's his job by state law to provide an education to all of them. So he told me a story about a young woman from Burma who was at 15 presented to the middle school, actually the high school principal, saying, here she is, she's yours. And at 15, she had never been in a formal education context in her life. And her English was not great. But principal took her in, and they had a refugee program. They gave her a set of battery tests that indicated her achievement was probably, I think it was like at a 4th grade level. And in one academic year, she tested at the end of that at the 7th or 8th grade level. Now, they're high-fiving each other in the faculty lounge because of this remarkable achievement. But by the standards set by the legislature of Iowa, she was still testing a grade below her grade level for her age, and she was labeled a failure. And her school was labeled as a failure because she was at reading and all this at a grade level. And he was apoplectic that he said, this child is a miracle. And my teachers were miracle workers in helping birth that miracle. She learned so much. But the state of Iowa achievement standard said she's a failure because she didn't make 4 years progress. She only made 3 years progress. So there's a case where the standards, the objective education standards of Iowa, did not account for the empirical reality of who's in the classrooms of Des Moines. And he said, it's my personal mission to rectify that. So there are, I think, because of this growing pluralism and the number of refugee children coming in, we have to wrestle with the fact, how do we measure their progress? We should label that young woman as a miracle. We should not label her as a failure. And it doesn't mean necessarily lowering our academic standards, but finding a way. So this is part of the complexity of religious pluralism. These issues are not going to be sorted overnight. But I'm hopeful that because of the emergence of this new generation of children coming to our shores and becoming new Americans, our institutions are going to have to adapt. That adaptation is going to be slow, it's going to be painful, there are going to be a lot of arguments, and it's going to be messy. But I do believe at some point in the not too distant future, our standards of educational materials and pedagogical techniques are going to catch up. So the bad news is they've got to catch up. The good news is I believe they will because of the heroic efforts of people like this superintendent in Des Moines. He himself is the product of a corn farm. So, you know, he's not an alien coming in. He's tried and true Iowan to his DNA level. So this is the messiness, if you will, of religious pluralism. And our country has gone through this in the past. We do have a history of slowly evolving and adapting, and the curve is never perfect. It's messy, and sometimes we recede. But I'm actually encouraged today that the fact, just the sheer fact of pluralism in our country is going to force us to adapt. And this is where I believe religious communities play a huge role. to say that because you're Muslim or you're Buddhist or you're whatever, you have a deep right, as deep a right as any other human being in this country, to have access to the best education, to human rights, to a job, to a career, to access to civic virtues and civic institutions. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be messy. So that's, I wish I had a better answer, but I'm actually hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cam. And with interfaith interaction today in America, what is something that you're hopeful for with the future, and then something that is concerning in the future?
I am hopeful because of the refugee work I saw. I really do believe at the grassroots level there are new forms of interreligious work going on to support refugees, and this is new. I'm troubled by the rise of the alt-right. I'm troubled by the reappearance of neo-Nazis more publicly. I never in my wildest dreams that I think at 61 years old, there would be people marching on the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, not far from where I live, wearing swastikas and proclaiming Heil Hitler and embracing neo-Nazis. I thought we'd sorted that one, and I'm wrong. We have not sorted that one. I am deeply disturbed by saying, you know, people chanting in the streets, Jews will not replace us. I thought we were better than that. And those folks scare me. And I want to ignore them. I want to close my eyes and wake up in the morning and hear they're gone. But that's not the case. So the rise of the neo-Nazis and the alt-right should be deeply disturbing to any American. So that's the good and that's the bad.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, my name is Katrina, and my question it's a little interesting, involves what I know is a majority of people our age who don't profess any religion. And so I was wondering, do those people who are maybe atheist or agnostic count in your eyes as like a separate group? Are they considered a group, or do they just kind of get like ignored in the whole interfaith religious conversation?
No, that's a great question. I had people show up on my doorstep early on with that question for me, because you know there's a humanist association, there are a number of non-religious groups. So first of all, let me say, what's happening demographically is the number of people who say they're atheist or agnostic is not really growing much. What is growing in this your generation, it's the millennial generation. What's happening there is a lower level of affiliation with official religious communities. Now you look at those people and they'll tell you very quickly, I'm not an atheist, I'm not an agnostic, I'm just not a card-carrying member of Church X or Church Y. Some people say they're spiritual, they're not religious, they're different nomenclature. Now that number is the fastest growing group, and it's a generational shift. It is your generation, it's not my generation. And sociologists predict, well, what's going to happen? Is that going to grow? Is it going to shrink? And, you know, there are a lot of guesses in that game. I think interreligious harmony has to include anybody who wants to show up at the table. I mean, it would be deeply ironic if you sponsor Interfaith Harmony Week, agnostics need not apply. Or, you know, agnostics not allowed, you know, you go into the other cafeteria line or something. That would be deeply ironic and counterproductive. So interreligious work and dialogue has got to take anybody who wants to show up. If you bar the door to somebody, you've kind of missed the whole point. And let's be honest too, for those among us who are Christians, not every Christian believes the whole thing all the time. Doubt is part of the Christian life. So if I get disqualified because there's like, my doubt ratio has gone up 2% overnight, I'm sorry, Shaun, we're not going to let you into Religious Harmony Week because we think your doubt meter's gone up too high. That kind of misunderstands at least the Christian faith, because it is faith, it's not certainty. So yeah, to me, interfaith harmony sort of assumes at the heart, anybody's welcome at this table, whether you believe, you don't believe, or whether you're not sure. So yeah, slamming doors to people based on some character or demographic background doesn't seem to me to be very inviting and kind of misses the point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. You've been a great audience.